Good afternoon from the Geneva at the United Nations. As the world marks World Press Freedom Day, 3rd May, concerns over transnational repression are growing. Turkey stands out as a key example, with the journalists in Europe facing ongoing legal and digital pressure. Today, we will focus on the gaps in protection. There's growing criticism that mechanisms such as Interpol are being misused by some states. To target exiled journalists, what stronger and more binding safeguards are needed to prevent such abuse?
Yeah, we definitely see the abuse of Interpol notices. So typically a journalist often won't even know if there is a red notice out against them, which massively restricts their travel, their ability to work, their ability to a family life, and more broadly their human rights. So it's really important that there's international cooperation to make sure that existing mechanisms do work properly, that mechanisms are properly in place, and really to understand that this kind of repression of journalists is not just harmful to the journalists themselves, but really undermines democratic societies as a whole.
I think the most important safeguard for protecting journalists from being attacked or persecuted by their own country when they are abroad is actually protection of the country where they are. Very often we find that Interpol, requests may be made through Interpol. So there is first a responsibility on Interpol to make sure that such frivolous or vexatious requests are not taken into account. And secondly, it's very important for the country where the journalist is to resist such requests. We, meaning the United Nations, has been in touch with Interpol, and they have tightened some of their rules, but still, Interpol is an intergovernmental organization. Governments are there, and there are still some loopholes that need to be addressed.
I think with Interpol, the most important structural question is transparency. And because of Interpol's history and because of Interpol's function, I think it's fair to say that civil society, states have to review the transparency obligations within the Interpol framework. Once transparency is dealt with, and once there is an opportunity for individuals to make representations in relation to live cases, I think the structural imbalance will be mitigated. And I think we need to look at these things through not the practice of individual states, but actually through how an international organization works and whether a fair balance is being achieved. And Interpol is a very good example of that.
Yeah, so I think also Interpol is one that's obviously also frequently where states can make a request for via Interpol for a red notice, and there are very many documented cases where there aren't sufficient safeguards for human rights defenders and journalists, where then someone could face they're not able to travel to specific other countries because there's an Interpol red notice against them that can't be removed. So I think that there needs to be more influence from states where as we've had in the discussion, where they're giving safe refuge to a journalist, then there's a kind of discussion about what happens if an Interpol red notice is issued. How is that independently assessed to make sure that it's being, to make sure the reasons that it's being issued are not to target that individual journalist. And I think there's also a role for international organizations to play in that, to make sure that there is dialogue with Interpol about the way that red notices are issued and actually verified.
What role do tech companies play in this space? Are platforms like Meta or Google doing enough to protect targeted journalists?
Yeah, one of the problems we often hear from journalists is that they're getting a lot of the threats and intimidation and abuse are coming online through these platforms, and there's no real recourse for them to have those comments removed or to be protected in any way. So discussions directly with the platforms are very difficult. We often don't know who exactly to go to, or those channels are kind of very difficult to find. So absolutely tech, given how much transnational repression is delivered through digital technologies, the big digital platforms should be more involved in finding solutions and in protecting the journalists.
Many journalists in exile face digital threats, but all journalists rely on digital technology to do their work. But journalists in exile are doubly dependent on these platforms because that is how they communicate with their audiences back home. That is how they collect their sources of information. So there is a huge responsibility, I believe, on the digital companies to make sure that journalists can operate safely on the platforms. Many of them are harassed. There are smear campaigns online. They're attacked by their own country or by others who don't like their political point of view. And in those kinds of situations, the platforms have a particular duty, given the public interest role that journalists have to protect journalists from being attacked by others. And of course, companies have means of stopping that, and also making sure that they are not harassed, attacked, or their websites. Sometimes there are attacks on the website. There are cybercrimes being committed against journalists. That too, of course, lies in the hands of the digital tech platform.
So I think that short answer, probably not doing enough at the moment, and I think oftentimes their platforms can be misused. So for example, oftentimes tech organizations and social media platforms are misused for the use of spyware, being used to target journalists. I know that there is, for example, a case in the US right now of WhatsApp suing the NSO group for the use of Pegasus on that platform. So there are efforts being made by these companies, but there's very sophisticated use now of copying of journalists' online platforms, such as their X platforms, and those being impersonated and then used to distribute disinformation and false content and personify that journalist. And there's a lot of issues of falsified kind of legal charges, of copyright issues being used to take down content issued by journalists who are living in exile. And so there needs to be more kind of robust thinking on the part of these social media platforms about how their platforms are misused to target journalists and what can actually be done to prevent that, ensure safety.
I want to ask that, is the current international legal framework sufficient to protect journalists in exile?
I think, in short, the international legal framework is sufficient. The question is it operating in a practical and effective way? And that really is a question that we need to put back to states, because it's states that are very much the master of their treaties and the master of their obligations. So the states are under various obligations under international law in this area. And what we've been working on as the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom is to speak to states at a bilateral level to really map out what those obligations mean in relation to the realities that journalists face today, including in relation to safe refuge and journalists in exile.
I think the thing with transnational repression is it's a quite systematized, really complex series of tools that are used against journalists and deployed in different ways. And states' institutional responses have been slow to catch up with that, really, to understand the complexity and depth of the threats and really to respond in a way that fully protects journalists. Awareness is rising, I think, internationally. I think there's a growing understanding of the nature of transnational threats, but that's really a process that's only just beginning. And a lot more awareness raising and understanding needs to take place so that law enforcement, government institutions, non-governmental groups understand better how to respond and give better protection.
From a range of different countries, transnational repression, as we've heard today from the panel, is a hugely growing issue, and states are becoming very sophisticated in the way that they're able to exert pressure and attacks on journalists, even when they're living in exile in other countries. So we've seen from even 2019 the murder of Jamal Khashoggi based in Turkey, and now journalists across the European Union, and I'm from the UK, we've seen journalists such as from BBC Persia who have faced attacks on the streets in London. So I think there is an increased need for states to be more aware of these threats and to respond more concretely by putting in place safety plans for journalists who are living in exile in advance, but also respond and try to strengthen accountability by actually investigating attacks on journalists while in exile, both physical and digital threats, because oftentimes most journalists in exile are using the digital sphere to continue their work and continue their reporting in the country they've been forced to flee from. So digital threats are just as important to respond to. So I'd say there aren't enough mechanisms in place to deal with this right now, and that needs to be felt both at the state and international organization level.
There have been cases where the Turkish government has sought, for example, the return of journalists who are living in different European countries or have sought to harass them. There have been many European countries that have given asylum to Turkish journalists, but sometimes these asylum processes are not strong enough to actually protect them from being harassed in the little town where they're living or in the place where they're working. So I think it is up to the European countries, first of all, to strengthen the protection mechanisms where the journalists are, but also to reach out to Turkey to explain that once a person is outside Turkey and has received asylum somewhere else, then that asylum has to be respected.
Transnational repression in itself against journalists isn't something new. It's something that's been around for decades. But what we've seen is that with the advent of faster digital technologies and technologies with greater reach, we've seen the range of tools being used really increase, and we've seen the state's capacity to repress transnationally increase as well, which means that overall we're seeing a rise in the number of cases.
There may be structural gaps in the enforcement mechanisms. So one example, something we've been working on as the high-level panel since 2020, is what happens when a journalist needs to leave their home state as a matter of urgency to avoid harm. Now, if you look at the legal framework, everything is in place. The problem is it doesn't work quickly enough. So one of our recommendations was an emergency visa mechanism that states could create to provide that kind of practical and effective recourse immediately. Some of the Media Freedom Coalition states have now, happily, we're in 2026, our recommendations were in 2020, have now created those emergency visas. And what we're focusing on now is what other legal protections those journalists need once they're
Within NATO, Turkey has the second largest army, as you know. This is affecting the exiled journalist problems within Europe?
Of course. The powerful of Turkey within NATO it is very, very important. And as it has been said in the room, the bilateral and multilateral relations affected the positions of some countries against Turkey, and this it's not in favor of victims.
Well, obviously, as Turkey has many bilateral and other relations with the European countries, that should not, however, interfere with the obligation of the countries, the European countries, to protect Turkish asylum seekers or Turkish journalists who are abroad, nor should it allow Turkey to use that channel of relationship to then try to seek to persecute its own citizens. Neither is right. Both sides need to respect that because this is the framework of international law. And when countries reach out to each other and establish their bilateral relationships, it is also within the framework of international law. So if you break that framework, if you weaken it, then of course you're weakening the whole system. And protection of human rights is a fundamental value of the European Union. So the European Union has to stand up for that fundamental value and should not allow bilateral concerns or commercial concerns with other states, Turkey or any other state, to interfere with that.
The financial problem of the exiled journalists.
Yeah, so I think there are, some efforts that we can look at, such as, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, specific EU countries worked to relocate and support whole media houses from Russia. So, for example, Medusa, who was relocated to Latvia, or RFE-RL that was relocated to Prague. But the issues that they face financially do not stop when they're in exile, and being able to kind of continue that work means that there's a huge reliance on international funding, international media. Obviously, states in general are in a funding crisis right now, but there needs to be continued priority of fundings these media organizations in exile, because and potentially funding not just from the kind of human rights and media budget, but from the security budget, because these media organizations are really on the front line of preventing disinformation from countries like Russia. And in exile, they're a huge lifeline for the communities in those countries where they're not having access to independent information. And so it should be seen really as, not just a human rights or a media issue, but a security issue, and supporting those journalists in exile as a vital part of that.
I was very happy to be the moderator of this panel because it was a very interesting panel, very insightful, because it really gave a broad description of the threats faced by journalists in exile, and especially this new and growing phenomenon of transnational repression, which affects not only journalists in exile, but also families and the entourage of journalists in exile back in the country of origin. So I think it was very timely. This is a growing phenomenon, and this is really an advocacy priority for OHCHR, which I work for. And we will continue to advocate, especially at the level of the Human Rights Council, for languages to be included on transnational repression in resolutions adopted by the Human Rights Council. This is already the case with the latest resolution on the safety of journalists, but also on freedom of expression, on civic space. So a lot can be done, is already done, but I think one of the panelists called for more collaboration, and I think we need more friendly states and more collaboration between states, national human rights institutions, civil society, UN bodies, and OHCHR to tackle that growing issue.
Do you think that this kind of events, organizations affect positively the solving these kind of problems?
I think the main impact of such events is really to raise awareness on phenomenon like transnational repression. It's also a way to identify ways to tackle those problems, and also to identify those responsible and those who can have leverage to influence and have an impact to address phenomenon like transnational repression. So the main impact is really outreach, more publicity around that phenomenon of transnational repression. To share really all the solidarity with journalists in exile, and especially those affected by transnational repression and other violations that were mentioned during the event today. We had a very good testimony from a Belarusian journalist, Jan Merkis, and he is one among others affected by transnational repression. And we need to think about them, because they are really the human faces of that kind of violations.
The panel held at the United Nations office in Geneva addressed the pressure and threats faced by journalists in exile. With participation of UN Special Rapporteur, speakers emphasized that journalists continue to face intimidation, surveillance, and harassment in different countries, even after leaving their home states. In recent years, many journalists from various countries, including Turkey, have been forced to work abroad. It was noted that being in exile doesn't fully ensure their safety, as digital harassment, legal pressure, and security risks can persist.